verse 12. If somebody who's your brother, who's a Hebrew slave, or a Hebrew woman will be sold to you, then then he works for you for 6 years, and the 7th year you let him go. What is this talking about? Rashi says, who's selling him to you? Others. We're talking about a case where the court sold him to you, meaning to say somebody's. So we're talking about that a guy steals money. The punishment for stealing money is not that you get sold into slavery. But if you steal money and you can't repay the double, they fine you double, then you get sold into slavery to pay for your loan, to pay for the money you stole. And they use the proceeds of the theft to pay the other person. But the verse has already said in Exodus when you purchase a Hebrew slave. So already in Exodus, we already learned about a slave who was sold by the court. So why is it being said twice? There are 2 things that are being introduced in this paragraph, Rashi says. Or else, why is Deuteronomy repeating it? So it's to tell us that a Hebrew slave woman also goes free after 6 years. But here it's very important distinction. Very important distinction. How does a Hebrew slave woman go free? Rashi is going to tell us this in a moment. There's a few distinctions between a man and a woman who's a slave. Because the Hebrew slave, how can he become a slave? If he's sold by the court or if he sells himself into slavery. How can a Hebrew woman become a slave? One way. There's only one way she can become a slave. Anybody know? Her father sells her. And then when does she go free? When she becomes 12, or if her master marries her, or she serves for 6 years prior to becoming 12. Now, this passage is not really so ecumenical, but we have to understand that. Hello there, Eitan. My mother was just asking about you. But we have to understand that Tosfos says that people were sold into that they arranged marriages of young children in order because life was short. People were poor, and they wanted to make certain that their daughters were cared for. So this was a way of making certain that their daughter was cared for. And that's why
it still happens, just not with Jews.
Yeah, that happened with the Taliban. The Taliban does it. Technically speaking,
Mexico drug lords, and other.
Yeah, but I believe that this is different. The Torah is saying you either have to marry her or she goes free. And if you marry her, then she gets a ketubah. So the Torah is not like the drug lords. She's not a sex slave. Okay, so we're not talking about a case of a woman whom the court sold. Because a woman is not sold for a theft, as it states, so. He is sold for his theft, but not her. We're talking about a minor girl who was sold into slavery. And it's teaching us that as long as she lasts 6 years before the signs of being an adult, then she has to go free. So that's the first thing. We're talking about a female who's sold into slavery. And she also goes free after 6 years, provided she hasn't gone through puberty yet, in which case she would go free right when she goes through puberty. Vod chidesh kan ta'anek tanik. And the second thing is that this passage is teaching us the concept of severance pay. Let's see what that means. Ki tishalchenu, when you send forth the slave, chavshi meimach, free from you, lo tishalchenu reikam, don't send him free. Ha'anek tanik lo, you have to give him a grant. You have to give him something. You have to give him from your sheep, from your grain, from your winery. That Hashem blessed you. You have Hashem, your God. You have to give him. She says, "Lashon adi," in the dormant, begova b'marat ayin, on a high place in a visible manner. Davar she'anikar she'ativosolo, something by which it is discernible that you've benefited him. V'yesh mefarshim lashon hatana al tzavaro. Some say that this means an expression of loading onto the freed slave's neck. So some say it means just a necklace, but you have to give him something good. You have to give him from your sheep, your flocks, your winery. I might think I only have to give him from these categories: sheep, granary, winery. Says the verse, from everything that God blessed him. Whatever your God blessed you with. Why are these things said specifically? Just like these things are included in the blessing. So to everything that increases naturally. Yatsu prados, you don't have to give him mules. And the Talmud in Tractate Kedushin teaches us how much you have to give him, mikol min v'min.
It's like the Jews were slaves, so this is one thing that, you're required to give gifts because you couldn't do that before. When you're a slave, obviously you have nothing to do.
No, but the Hebrew slave does acquire something. Canaanite slave, you're right. The Talmud says Kona Masha, Kona Eva, Kona Rabba. You're right that the Talmud says about a Canaanite, whatever he acquires, the master acquires. But a Hebrew slave is not the same. The Hebrew slave has his own possessions. So the Talmud is just introducing this idea that if somebody works for you in a very serious way, you'll have to give him severance. Curious what the secular world, what their value attitude is about severance. I don't think it's a law anywhere. Is it a law?
No, you have to give, there's something called the Warren Act. You have to give people a warning before you fire them.
What do you mean? You're being fired?
No. There's certain, you have to give people like 6 weeks notice or something. If your company is big enough to fall under the Warren Act, the federal law.
Okay, so you have to give them 6 weeks notice, and then they work during that time, or you tell them to leave?
Up to you.
Yeah, but I think if it's
They have to get paid.
Here, Rabbi, he's not being fired. His term is up because
Yeah,
either
he's not
the
being
debt
fired.
was paid or the 6 years are up.
No, right. He's not being fired. His term is up, but when he leaves you after working there, you have
A
to give him
bonus.
severance.
It's like giving him a bonus, just like somebody have deal they're going to give before Christmas.
Plenty of Jews give gifts too.
I don't know. I never got a Christmas bonus.
You get Hanukkah presents, I hope. Okay, so there is a Warren Act, which means that you have to give somebody notice before firing them. But I don't know, like other faiths have this obligation. So basically, if somebody works for you, if you're Jewish, should bear this in mind, even though it's not technically obligated, because this is referring to a discrete case. There's certainly the spirit of this law, which says somebody works for you, you're supposed to give him a couple of weeks, depending upon the nature and the length of time in which they work for you. It doesn't tell us exactly how much you have to give, but it says you have to give something from each of the categories.
Is it for men and women?
Yeah, it says specifically for men and for women. V'zacharta, you have to remember, ki eved hayisam eretz Mitzrayim. You have to remember you were slaves. V'yivtecha Hashem alkecha, and God redeemed you. Alkein anochim mitzavcha sadavar hazayom. Therefore, I'm commanding this to you. You have to remember that you were slaves, and guess what you got when you left Egypt? And I gave you a grant once and then again. Mi bizas Mitzrayim, ubizas hayam. Before you left Egypt, you took from the spoils, and before you left the sea, you took from the spoils. Afata hanek ushenelo. Give him a grant once and again. Give him a grant once and again. That means to save. If the slave has brought you a blessing, give him more than you're obligated to. So now this is a reminder of what we learned in Parashas Mishpatim. If the slave should say to you, I don't want to leave you. Now again, we're talking about the Hebrew slave. The Hebrew slave says, I don't want to leave you. I want to stay with you. I don't want to leave you after 6 years. You have to take a martzea. Martzea is like a drill. They translate it as an awl. It's a type of drill. And you place it in his ear, ubadelas, and in the door. I see you eyeing these hats. Did you ever get a hat like this, Eitan? Okay, fine, perfect. So it says you should take this awl, place it in his ear and the door, and then you should be a slave forever. And also you should do this to your maidservant. Rashi says, Eved Olam, you'll be your slave forever. Yachol Kamashma. I might think, literally says the verse, the Shaftem Ishach Uzasto, and the Jubilee year you go back. Everybody goes back to his family. Means to say that Olamo means until the Jubilee year. So it means that he's a slave up until the Jubilee year, but then at the Jubilee year, he goes free. So he doesn't go free at the sabbatical year, and he goes free at the Jubilee year. He doesn't go free after 6 years, he goes free at the Jubilee year. Rashi in Mishpatim tells us why you stick an awl through his ear and at the doorpost. Do you remember the Rashi? Does anybody remember the Rashi? What's the reason why you stick a drill through his ear and drill him to the doorpost? Meaning to say, you put the ear through his ear in the door, you drill his ear to the door. It's like, so my father is saying it right. My father is saying the same, Rashi says in Mishpatim, the same ear that heard you to be, that said to you at Egypt, you shall be slaves to me and not slaves to others. And you say you want to be a slave to another man, we're going to drill a hole in that ear. The same doorpost, which I told you, you should put a mezuzah on the door. Remember that you left Egypt to be a slave to me and not to others. So that's why you do it by the doorpost. So somebody who says, I want to be a slave, I don't want to be free, and I want to be a slave to others, is fundamentally missing the essence of our faith, which is to be a slave to God. He's copping out. He's selling out. God didn't create us to be slaves. You should do the same thing to your maid. Give her a grant. I might think you're supposed to put an awl through her ear. Only the male slave gets his ear pierced, but not the female. From here we learn that a man is supposed to have an earring and not a woman. That's just a joke. That's just a joke. But a man is supposed to have a piercing in his ear, but not the woman. That's literally what it says. Okay. It should not be hard in your eyes when you send him free from you. Because there's double the earnings of a hired worker. He has worked for you for 6 years. God will bless you, or God has blessed you for all that you do. What does this mean? Rashi says, Mikan Amru, Eved ivri oved bein bayom bein balayla. This Hebrew slave has worked twice as hard for you. So therefore, don't be upset. You're sending him free. He's done his time. The slave works during the day and at night. How has he worked at night? Zeu kifayim shabavodas toriyam. Therefore, he's double the work of the person who works during the day. Ma'u avodas balayla. Do you know how he works at night? Anybody know how the slave works at night? He has a very hard job. Rabba Moser lo shifcha Cananis. His master says, I'm going to give you this Canaanite slave woman, and it's going to be your job, it's going to be your job to create children with this Canaanite slave woman, and those children are considered Canaanite slaves that the master owns. So he's basically propagating or increasing the master's slave population. So he's working day and at night.
Where could I sign up?
Dr. Shore,
I'm kidding.
every time
I'm
you
kidding.
every time you can make an off-color joke, it's going to cost you, Dr. Shore.
I'm kidding. No, I figured at night he'll put coal under the bed to keep him warm.
No, that's not what he says. That's not what he says. He says at night his job is to work for the master.
Right.
I mean, to work with the Canaanite slave woman.
What warm-blooded American would do that? Nobody would.
Well, he already has his own wife and children.
I know.
Yeah, so he comes into the marriage with them, and the master says, okay, you gotta work with this Canaanite woman too to make children. Now,
yeah, but at that time, that was the thing. You know, many wives at that time, right?
You were allowed to. This wasn't his wife. He was just supposed to impregnate her. But
right.
That might have been why that's what it says in Mishpat, and that's why he wants to stay there, because he likes his Canaanite slave woman and he wants to stay with her. So that's the reason probably why he wants to slave. So that's the reason. Now, but you said he has to put coals under the bed at night because he's sleeping in the cold area. But the Talmud tells us, Kona Aved, Kona Rabo. You acquire a slave, you acquire a master. What does that mean? That the slave eats what the master eats. The slave sleeps where the master sleeps. Is that this type of Hebrew slave, as opposed to the Canaanite slave, is treated better than the master himself. And so much so that if the master has only one pillow, who gets that pillow? The slave. Yes, Jerry, you are raising your hand so patiently.
Yes, 2 points. By the Jewish slave owner keeping this child, isn't the slave owner really committing theft? He's stealing this child away from the man, the servant who will eventually leave at sometime in the future.
So let's just answer that question. The answer is the Torah tells us that child is considered a Canaanite slave. So that child will never go free with the master, with the slave. That child is a Canaanite, and the master owns the slave and he owns his offspring. So that is a Canaanite slave. Okay.
The other point I'd like to make is I understand that the American Christian world decided on enslaving the blacks from Africa based upon these Hebrew verses, but they didn't follow the idea that this Negro slave should only be enslaved for 6 years.
Well, I think that it's obviously, I believe that it's a horrible thing that we enslave other human beings at any point. But I just want to point out that if you look back at the beginning of Genesis, it's the curse of Ham was that he be a slave forever. So therefore, it wasn't for 6 years. This is referring, the idea of a 6-year slave is, like I said, that there are 2 types of slaves. One is where you enslave your own brother, the other Hebrew slave, and that is not really what we would call slavery. Now it's like indentured servitude or some sort of servant in the house. He has to do his time, work for you. But then there is the Canaanite slave, and that is a slavery which is very similar to the slavery that there existed in North America. And those slaves did not go free. The Canaanite slaves did not go free. In fact, the Torah prohibits you from freeing such a slave. Now, there were ways for them to go free, but you weren't supposed to free the slave, at least according to the Torah. Okay. Yeah, so my father is correct. My father says that there are ways that those slaves go free. And the ways is there are 24 limbs, which if you knocked out one of those 24 limbs or digits from the slave, then that slave automatically went free. So there were ways that this Canaanite slave went free, but it's not so simple to say, well, then they misread the biblical text, because the biblical text does have slavery. Of course, it was written 3,500 years ago. So things have changed since then.
There was an accident where you injured a slave. Does it make any difference? You say if you knocked out.
Excuse me. I believe that it does, that even if I have to look back at the Gemara, but I believe even if you did it by accident, the slave goes free. I believe, because it's damages, and damages, we have this concept of Adam Muzaf Mazika Olam. A person is always considered to be a damager. So let's say you accidentally crashed into my flower bed, and you said, well, it was an accident. I say, okay, pay for it. I mean, I probably wouldn't tell it to you, and I probably don't care, but the point is that if somebody damages your car by accident, yeah, well, that's the point. That's the point, that you have to pay the damages. I mean, maybe, again, we have Dan with us, he could tell us, is there any way in which you damage somebody and you say, well, it's an accident, I shouldn't be liable? So keep putting you on the spot, Dan, sorry.
Well, so, I mean, the negligence is whether or not it was reasonable.
Right,
If you harm somebody and your actions were reasonable, and just for some reason, like I went like this and somehow it's said in a chain of events that caused you to be harmed, it was reasonable for me to do that, then even though you've been harmed, I'm not liable to you.
well, that's a little bit different. Like if I put this down and then you're sitting over there and then you have a heart attack as a result, that's not my fault. But we're talking about a case where you actually damage the person. But they also, the Talmud says, that person is always considered to be a damager. So let's say you're sitting, here's the case, a classic case based upon the Talmud. Let's say you're sitting on an airplane and you're sleeping, and then you go like this, and you knock into the guy and you break his glasses. Do you have liability? So according to Jewish law, you do.
Not, and for American law, not necessarily, if your actions were reasonable. If you're driving reasonably, but you hit somebody, right? Maybe because they stop short or whatever, but you damage them, you're not liable.
Well, then that's driving is not necessarily a good example, because that could have been their fault. If they stop short, that's their fault. But that's not necessarily the best.
Or even, okay, even if they didn't contribute to it, what you were doing was reasonable, you're not liable. That's negligence, means you have to have acted unreasonable. Yes, that's what tort trials are all about.
So if you're driving, if you're driving and you driving reasonably, you're driving the speed limit,
Yeah.
and yet you just hit this guy's car, then you have to figure out if you were negligent, if you were
Right.
misdriving.
Right,
But
of course, now there's no fault.
but the Talmud says a person is always supposed to be responsible for their own actions. Adam muad la'olam. So like there's this concept of muad, where if you've done damage more than a few times, if your ox is gored 3 times, then we view that ox as you have to reasonably expect that ox will gore. And so then their payments are extra. But a person is always considered to be muad. So a person's always supposed to be in charge of their bodies. So therefore, you're supposed to be aware while you're sleeping that if the burden is upon you to make sure you don't knock off that guy's glasses while you're sleeping. You can't say I fell asleep, I'm not responsible. No, your job is to make sure that when you sleep, you don't punch the guy next to you and break his nose. That's your job.
So that's the difference between.
I don't know, yeah. Well, isn't that a state law, Dan?
So it is state law, but it's common law in America.
Okay,
Every state
has the same law.
that's what the definition of a tort is that you negligently cause harm, not that you just cause harm.
But their Talmud is saying that this is negligence. Because the person is negligent, he's responsible for his body. So if his body hurt somebody, it was his negligence. As opposed to if your dog bites somebody, a dog is not necessarily always considered to be negligent. We had a dog that bit people. My parents had a dog.
Difficult.
She was a difficult dog.
So in America, there's one bite.
One bite, you're out.
No, if the first time the dog bites someone, you're not held liable. Then, because you have no reason to know that the dog is going to bite somebody. If the dog bit somebody a second time, then it's on you because you should have known that your dog was a bite.
Yeah, we knew.
Okay.
Okay, we'll stop the recording here. But like I'll tell you what joke.